The alarm on my wrist screamed before I even understood why. Smoke poured through a cracked hull vent, and somewhere beneath the twisted metal of a shattered breeding chamber, something was crying. Not an alarm, not a machine. A living sound, thin and desperate, cutting through the chaos like a blade through fog. My name is Kale Voss, and I was not supposed to be a hero that day. I was supposed to be counting crates. I worked logistics for the outer listening post stationed at the edge of Draconi territory, a quiet corner of the galaxy where humans and dragons had signed just enough treaties to avoid open conflict, but not enough to actually trust each other. My job was simple: catalog salvage, verify manifests, stay out of politics. That was the entire plan for my career, right up until the moment a Draconi breeding vessel drifted into our sector with a ruptured hull and a cargo hold full of secrets nobody wanted me to see. The ship had taken damage from what the official report called a mechanical failure. I had my doubts even then, standing in the wreckage with my scanner in hand, boots crunching over scorched decking. Draconi engineering did not fail quietly. It failed spectacularly, or not at all. But that was a problem for people with more stars on their shoulders than me. I was assigned to the recovery team almost as an afterthought. Someone needed to inventory what survived, and nobody senior wanted to spend 6 hours crawling through a broken dragon ship that still smelled of ozone and fear, so they sent me, along with 2 engineers who mostly ignored me, and a Draconi liaison named Vreketh, who made it very clear he considered this entire mission beneath his station. Vreketh was tall even by Draconi standards, easily 9 feet when he stood at full height, with scales the color of dark iron, and eyes that tracked me the way a predator tracks something it has already decided is harmless. He did not speak to me unless necessary. When he did speak, it was usually to correct my pronunciation of Draconi terminology, or to remind me that humans moved too slowly for serious work. I let it go. I always let it go. Diplomacy was not my job, but staying employed was, and staying employed meant not starting incidents with 9-foot aliens who could probably remove my head with one clawed hand if they felt sufficiently insulted. We moved deeper into the ship, past crushed corridors and shattered viewing ports that looked out into the endless black of space. The breeding chamber was near the ship's core, heavily reinforced, which was likely the only reason any of it had survived the initial impact. When we finally breached the doors, the sight inside stopped me cold. Nests. Dozens of them, built in careful rows along curved walls, most of them empty, their shells long since hatched and cleared away. But 3 nests near the back had not been cleared. 2 held nothing but broken shell fragments and scorched material, clear evidence that whatever had been inside had not survived the crash. The 3rd nest was different. I heard the sound again, closer now, and my scanner picked up a heat signature too small to be an adult Draconi and too warm to be debris. I stepped toward the nest before Vreketh could stop me, and there, curled in the wreckage of broken shell, was a hatchling. He could not have been more than a few days old, judging by the softness of his scales and the way his wings hung loose and useless against his small body. He was the size of my forearm, gray as ash from nose to tail, with eyes too large for his face and a body trembling from cold or fear or both. The other hatchlings in the chamber, the healthy ones from the intact nests, had already been collected and moved to safety hours earlier. Nobody had come back for this one. I crouched down slowly, the way you approach any frightened animal, and the hatchling flinched at the movement but did not flee. He could not flee. His wings were too weak, his legs too unsteady beneath him. He simply curled tighter into the broken shell and made that thin, desperate sound again, staring up at me with eyes that held no understanding of what I was, only the certainty that everything around him had gone terribly wrong. Vreketh's voice came from behind me, flat and final. "He is a runt. Leave him." I looked back at the Draconi liaison, genuinely confused. Leave him for what? For recovery? For treatment? Vreketh's expression did not change, which I was beginning to understand was worse than anger. "For nature to decide," he said. The clutch already rejected him. You can see it in his coloring. Wrong shade, wrong size. He would not have survived a normal hatching cycle regardless of the crash. This is simply happening sooner than expected. I stared at him, then back down at the small creature shivering in the wreckage, simply happening sooner than expected, as if the hatchling's death was a scheduled event, that the crash had merely moved up on the calendar, as if there was nothing more to discuss. I did not have a plan. I want to be honest about that, because looking back, everything that followed started with a decision I made in maybe 4 seconds, standing in the ruins of a stranger's ship, staring down at a creature that had never done anything wrong, except be born the wrong color. I picked him up. He weighed almost nothing, light as a bundle of dry branches, and his whole body went rigid in my hands for a moment, before something in him seemed to understand that I was not going to drop him, or crush him, or leave him where he lay. He pressed himself against my chest, small claws catching in the fabric of my jacket, and made a sound that was different from the desperate cry before, quieter, almost a question. Vrekath's tail moved in a slow, deliberate arc across the deck, a gesture I had learned meant irritation among his kind. This is not your place to interfere, human. Clutch matters are draconi law. I did not put the hatchling down. I am aware, I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. I am not interfering with clutch law. I am recovering biological salvage from a vessel under joint recovery jurisdiction, which is exactly what I was sent here to do. It was a technicality, and a thin one, but it was true. Our recovery agreement with the Draconi Compact gave human personnel authority over salvage classification during joint operations, and nothing in that agreement specified that salvage could not be alive. I did not know if the argument would hold up under real scrutiny. I did not particularly care in that moment. I only knew that the small creature in my arms had stopped shaking quite so hard, and I was not about to hand him back to a nest full of broken shells. Vrekath studied me for a long moment, the kind of look that made the hair on my arms stand up, and then, to my genuine surprise, he simply turned and walked away, muttering something in Draconi that my translator rendered only as an untranslatable expression of contempt. He did not try to stop me. He did not report me on the spot. He simply left, as though watching a human make a foolish decision was not worth the effort of correcting. I stood alone in the wrecked breeding chamber, holding a hatchling dragon against my chest, and I had absolutely no idea what I had just agreed to become responsible for. The walk back to the shuttle felt longer than it should have. The 2 engineers on my recovery team had already loaded their salvage crates and were waiting by the airlock, and both of them stared at me with expressions somewhere between confusion and concern when they saw what I was carrying. One of them, a woman named Priya Sangera who handled most of our mechanical salvage assessments, raised an eyebrow so high it nearly vanished into her hairline. "Voss," she said slowly, "is that a live dragon?" "He is a hatchling," I said, as though that somehow made the situation less absurd. "He needs care. The Draconi crew already wrote him off." Priya looked at the small grey creature, then back at me, then back at the creature again. "He's kind of cute, actually, in a terrifying future apex predator sort of way." I appreciated that she did not immediately tell me I had lost my mind, though I suspected that thought was not far behind her expression. The other engineer, a quiet man named Callum Ashford, simply shook his head and muttered something about paperwork before climbing into the shuttle without further comment. The hatchling stayed pressed against me the entire flight back to the station, his small body rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths, his eyes tracking every movement in the cramped shuttle cabin with a kind of wary alertness that made me wonder just how much a creature this young could actually understand. He did not cry again. He did not struggle. He simply watched, and occasionally, when the shuttle shuddered through a patch of turbulence, his claws would tighten against my jacket, as though bracing for something worse to happen. I found myself talking to him, quietly, the way people talk to frightened animals, even though the animals cannot understand the words. I told him he was safe now. I told him nobody was going to leave him behind again. I do not know why I said it. I only know that it felt important to say it, even to a creature who had no way of understanding English, because some part of me needed him to hear the tone if not the meaning. By the time we docked at the station, word had already started to spread. I do not know how. News on a listening post moves faster than light, faster than any transmission protocol should reasonably allow, and by the time I stepped off the shuttle with a hatchling dragon cradled against my chest, half the maintenance crew had already gathered near the docking bay under the thinnest possible excuses for being there. Station Commander Elias Whitmore met me at the base of the ramp, arms crossed, expression unreadable in the particular way that career officers cultivate for exactly these situations. He looked at the hatchling. He looked at me. He did not immediately say anything, which somehow felt worse than if he had started shouting. "Voss," he finally said, "care to explain?" I explained as best I could. The crash, the breeding chamber, the rejected clutch, Vrekath's flat refusal to intervene, and my own decision to classify the hatchling as recovered biological salvage rather than leave him to die in the wreckage. I kept my voice steady and my explanation as procedural as possible, because I had learned a long time ago that officers responded better to procedure than to emotion, even when emotion was the actual reason behind every decision I had made in the last 2 hours. Commander Whitmore listened without interrupting, his eyes occasionally drifting to the small creature in my arms, who had gone very still and very quiet, as though sensing that his fate was currently being discussed by people speaking a language he did not understand. When I finished, Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You do understand this creates a diplomatic problem. I understand that leaving him to die would have been simpler for everyone except him," I said. That was probably not the wisest thing to say to a station commander, but it was true, and I was tired, and the adrenaline of the last 2 hours had left me with considerably less patience for careful phrasing than I usually maintained. Whitmore's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, and I could not tell if it was frustration or something closer to reluctant respect. "He is your responsibility now," Whitmore finally said. "Not the station's, not the compact's, yours. If this becomes a problem, Voss, it becomes your problem first." "I understand," I said, and I meant it, even though I had absolutely no idea what caring for a hatchling dragon actually required. I did not know what he ate. I did not know how he slept, how he grew, what dangers existed for a creature this young, or how long it would take before he was large enough to be genuinely dangerous to have around a station full of people. What I did know, standing there with his small heartbeat pressed against my chest, faster than my own, was that I was not going to change my mind. The medical bay gave him a full examination that evening, more out of curiosity than actual medical necessity, since none of our station physicians had any real experience treating Draconi physiology. Dr. Naomi Whitfield, our chief medical officer, ran every scan she could justify, muttering the entire time about how none of her training had prepared her for treating a species that could probably outlive the station itself if given the chance. "He is small," she finally said, setting down her scanner. "Valderweight, even for a hatchling this age. His wing structure is underdeveloped, likely a genuine physical difference, rather than simple prematurity. His coloring is unusual too. I do not have Draconi genetic references on file to compare, but from what little data we do have, gray like this is not common." "That is what the Draconi crew said," I told her. "They called him a runt, said his coloring marked him as defective." Naomi frowned, running her hand gently along the hatchling's back as he sat curled in a heated recovery blanket on the examination table, watching both of us with those enormous, wary eyes. "Defective seems like a strong word for a color difference," she said, "but I am not a xenobiologist. I can tell you he is healthy enough to survive with proper care. Whether he thrives is going to depend a lot on what kind of care he actually gets." I looked down at the small gray shape in the blanket, and he looked back up at me, and for the first time since I had pulled him out of that wrecked breeding chamber, something in his posture relaxed, just slightly, as though some instinct buried deep inside him had decided, tentatively, that I might be safe. I did not know his name yet. I did not know what he would grow into, how large he would become, or what kind of storm I had just invited into my quiet, uneventful life of counting crates and filing manifests. I only knew that somewhere in the wreckage of a ship that had already decided he was not worth saving, I had made a different choice, and I was not going to take it back. The station settled into an uneasy sort of curiosity over the following days, crew members finding excuses to walk past my quarters, engineers asking pointed questions about dragon biology they clearly did not care about until an hour earlier, and more than one person quietly asking if they could see him, as though he were some kind of exhibit rather than a living creature trying to understand a world that had already tried to discard him once. I did not mind the attention, not really. What I minded was the growing awareness, settling slowly into my chest like a stone, that this had never been a simple decision. Somewhere out beyond our station, word of a human recovering a rejected Draconi hatchling was already spreading through channels I could not see and could not control, and I had a feeling, quiet but persistent, that this was only the beginning of a much larger problem. But that evening, sitting in my quarters with the hatchling curled against my side, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm for the first time since I had found him, I decided the problem could wait until morning. For now, he was warm, he was fed, he was alive. And for the first time in his very short life, he was not alone. Morning did not bring peace, it brought a summons. I was still half asleep, the hatchling curled in a nest of blankets I had rigged from spare bedding, when my communicator chimed with a priority message from Commander Whitmore. "Report to my office immediately," it read, followed by a second line that made my stomach drop. "Bring the hatchling." I dressed quickly, gathered the small grey creature into my arms, and made my way through the station's narrow corridors, ignoring the curious glances from crew members already awake and moving through their morning routines. The hatchling seemed to sense my tension, his claws pressing more firmly into my jacket, his large eyes tracking every person we passed with a wariness that felt older than his few days of life should have allowed. Whitmore's office was small and utilitarian, the same as every other office on the station, but it felt considerably more intimidating, with two Draconi representatives already seated across from his desk when I walked in. One of them was Vrekath, expression as unreadable as ever. The other was someone I did not recognize, an older Draconi, with scales a deep, weathered green, and a bearing that suggested significant rank within whatever hierarchy the compact used to organize itself. The hatchling still cradled against my chest, and I felt every eye in the room settle on the small creature with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "This is Ambassador Thren Caldorath," Whitmore said, introducing the unfamiliar Draconi. "She has been sent to review the circumstances of the hatchling's recovery." Ambassador Caldorath studied me for a long moment before speaking, her voice measured and precise in a way that suggested decades of diplomatic experience. "Human," she said, "I understand you removed a rejected hatchling from a Draconi vessel without proper authorization." "I have authorization under the Joint Salvage Agreement," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Section 4 covers biological recovery during joint operations. I did not violate any treaty terms." "The letter of the law, perhaps," Caldorath said, her tail flicking slightly in a gesture I still could not fully interpret. "But the spirit of clutch tradition is not something your treaty was designed to address. When a hatchling is rejected by its clutch, it is because that hatchling carries traits unsuited to survival. This is not cruelty, human. It is nature ensuring the strength of future generations." I looked down at the small creature in my arms, who had gone very still, as though he understood, on some instinctive level, that he was the subject of the conversation happening above his head. "He is alive. He is healthy, according to our medical staff. Whatever traits marked him as unwanted, they have not stopped him from surviving so far." Caldorath's eyes narrowed slightly, though whether from irritation or genuine consideration, I could not tell. "Survival in the short term is not the same as viability in the long term," she said. "Runts often appear healthy in early stages before underlying weaknesses manifest. This is well documented in Draconi breeding records spanning centuries." I felt a flash of frustration rise in my chest, sharp and immediate, though I forced myself to keep my voice level. "With respect, Ambassador, I have not seen those records, and I suspect neither has anyone else on this station. What I have seen is a healthy hatchling who was left to die not because of any medical certainty, but because of a color difference in his scales." The room went very quiet. Vreketh's tail stopped moving entirely, and Kaldoreth's expression shifted into something I could not quite categorize, somewhere between offense and reluctant curiosity. You speak boldly for a species that has held space travel for less than 3 centuries, Kaldoreth finally said. I speak honestly, I replied, because I do not think honesty requires centuries of practice. Whitmore, who had been silent through this exchange, cleared his throat carefully. Ambassador, he said, with all due respect, the hatchling was legally recovered under existing treaty terms. Unless the Compact wishes to formally challenge that recovery through proper channels, I do not believe this station is obligated to surrender him. Kaldoreth was quiet for a long moment, studying me, studying the hatchling, studying the careful neutrality on Whitmore's face. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying a weight that made it clear this was not the end of the conversation, only a pause in it. This matter is not settled, Commander. I will be reporting this recovery to the Compact Council. Whether they choose to pursue formal reclamation will not be my decision alone to make. She rose from her seat, Vreketh following a moment later, and the two of them left without further ceremony, their footsteps echoing down the corridor outside, long after the door had closed behind them. Whitmore let out a slow breath and rubbed a hand across his face. You realize you may have just started something considerably larger than a single hatchling, Voss. I looked down at the small creature in my arms, who had finally relaxed slightly now that the room had emptied of tension, his eyes half closed, exhaustion from the stress finally catching up with him. I know, I said quietly. I do not regret it. Whitmore studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, the careful mask of command, giving way to something more personal. Neither do I, actually, he admitted, but you should prepare yourself. The Compact does not take kindly to humans interfering with what they consider internal matters, even matters as small as a single rejected hatchling. This could escalate. I nodded, though privately, I was not entirely sure what escalation would even look like in this context. War over one small grey dragon seemed absurd on its face, and yet something in Kaldoreth's tone had suggested this was not simply about one hatchling. It was about precedent, about what it meant for a draconic tradition to be openly challenged by a species the Compact had never fully respected to begin with. I left Whitmore's office with considerably more weight on my shoulders than I had carried walking in, but the hatchling, sensing perhaps that the immediate danger had passed, had fallen fully asleep against my chest, his small body rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm that felt entirely disconnected from the political storm building somewhere above our heads. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. I returned to my regular duties, cataloging salvage and filing manifests, but the hatchling came with me nearly everywhere, tucked into a sling I had improvised from spare fabric, since separating from me even for short periods seemed to trigger a distress response that neither of us particularly enjoyed managing. Dr. Whitfield assured me this was likely a normal imprinting behavior, though she admitted she was working entirely from theory rather than established draconic medical literature. Crew members had mostly stopped staring by the 3rd day, though I still caught the occasional whispered conversation trailing off when I entered a room. Priya, the engineer who had first seen me carrying him off the shuttle, became something of an unofficial ally, stopping by my quarters in the evenings with spare fabric scraps and questions about how he was adjusting. He's got a name yet? She asked one evening, watching the hatchling investigate a loose thread on my blanket with the intense, single-minded focus that seemed to define most of his waking hours. I had been thinking about it, actually, turning the question over in my mind during quiet moments between shifts. I want something that means something, I told her, not just a label. Priya raised an eyebrow. Like what? I looked down at him, at the ash-gray scales that had marked him as unwanted, that had nearly cost him his life before he had even properly opened his eyes. Ash, I said finally. His name is Ash. Priya smiled, a small, genuine expression that felt like the first real warmth I had seen from anyone regarding this situation since the whole ordeal had started. I like it, she said. Feels right. It did feel right, and from that evening forward, that was his name, spoken not as a label assigned by circumstance, but as something chosen, something that belonged to him, rather than to the tragedy of his rejection. Not everyone on the station shared Priya's warmth toward the situation. Callum Ashford, the quiet engineer who had barely spoken 2 words to me since the recovery mission, cornered me near the mess hall a few days later, his expression carrying none of the neutrality he usually maintained. "You understand what you have done," he said, without preamble, glancing briefly at Ash, who was dozing in his sling against my chest. "You have made this station a target for compact scrutiny over a single animal." "He is not just an animal," I said, keeping my voice level, despite the flare of irritation his tone provoked in me. "To the Draconi, he is exactly that," Callum said. "A rejected clutch member with no legal standing beyond what human sympathy has granted him. And human sympathy is not going to matter much if the Compact decides this incident threatens the stability of our treaty. Do you understand what happens to a listening post if that treaty collapses?" I did understand, at least in the abstract sense, that every station employee understood the fragile political architecture holding this section of space together. But understanding the abstract risk and feeling it settle into something real and personal were 2 very different experiences, and standing there with Callum's pointed questions hanging in the air between us, I felt that shift happening in real time. "I am not going to give him back," I said finally, quietly but with a conviction that surprised even me. "Whatever happens with the Compact, whatever pressure comes down on this station, I am not changing that decision." Callum studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then he simply shook his head and walked away without further comment, leaving me standing alone in the corridor with a sleeping hatchling and a growing certainty that the coming weeks were going to test that conviction in ways I could not yet fully anticipate. That certainty proved correct sooner than I expected. 3 days later, a formal transmission arrived from the Compact Council, addressed not to Commander Whitmore, but directly to the station's governing authority, requesting a full review of the hatchling's recovery status and a formal hearing to determine, in the transmission's careful diplomatic language, the appropriate disposition of the disputed clutch member. Disputed clutch member. Not Ash, not even hatchling. A phrase stripped of every trace of the small, curious, increasingly bold creature who had, in the span of little more than a week, learned to recognize my voice among a dozen others, learned to nudge my hand with his snout when he wanted attention, learned to fall asleep pressed against my side, with a trust that felt entirely unearned, given how briefly we had known each other. I read the transmission twice, my hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a slow burning anger I had not fully expected to feel this intensely. "They are calling him property," I said to Priya later that evening, the transmission still open on my tablet, as Ash chased a length of ribbon across my quarters with clumsy, uncoordinated enthusiasm. "Disputed clutch member. As if he is a crate of salvage they are arguing over shipping rights to." Priya watched Ash tumble over his own feet, recover, and immediately resume the chase with undiminished determination. "He does not look much like disputed cargo to me," she said. "No," I agreed, watching him with something that felt uncomfortably close to fierce protectiveness. "He does not." The hearing was scheduled for the following week, giving me exactly 7 days to prepare an argument I had no legal training to construct, against representatives who had likely been navigating compact law for longer than I had been alive. Whitmore offered what support the station could officially provide, but he was careful to remind me, more than once, that the ultimate outcome would rest on precedent and treaty interpretation, areas where the compact held significant advantage. I spent those 7 days buried in treaty documentation, salvage law, and every scrap of precedent I could find regarding joint recovery operations, snatching sleep in short, uneasy stretches with Ash curled against my side, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that had somehow become the only truly calming thing in my increasingly chaotic days. I did not know, as that week wore on, whether careful legal argument would be enough to keep him. I did not know what the Compact Council actually wanted, whether this was truly about tradition or about something larger, some test of how far humans could be pushed before we either backed down or pushed back. I only knew that somewhere in the space of a single desperate week, a small grey hatchling with wrong-colored scales had become something I was not prepared to lose without a fight. And for the first time since arriving at this quiet, unremarkable listening post, I found myself preparing for something that felt less like logistics work and considerably more like a battle. The hearing chamber was colder than I expected, both in temperature and in atmosphere, a circular room near the station's administrative core that had clearly been repurposed for the occasion rather than designed for it. Rows of seating curved around a central floor, and by the time I arrived with Ash tucked securely in his sling, nearly every seat was already filled. Word had spread further than I realized. Station crew occupied one section, drawn by curiosity and, I suspected, a growing sense of investment in how this would end. A delegation of Draconi representatives occupied another section entirely, led by Ambassador Caldorath, with Vrekath seated just behind her, his expression as carefully unreadable as ever. And near the front, in a position that made it clear he held some manner of authority over the proceedings, sat a Draconi I did not recognize, older even than Caldorath, his scales faded to a pale silver that spoke of considerable age. Commander Whitmore leaned toward me as we took our seats. "That is Elder Vashtir," he murmured, "senior council member. His presence means the compact is taking this more seriously than I expected." I felt my stomach tighten at that information, though I kept my expression as neutral as I could manage, one hand resting protectively over Ash, who had gone very still and quiet, sensing perhaps that this room held a different kind of tension than any he had encountered before. The proceedings opened with a formal recitation of Draconi Clutch Law, delivered by Caldorath in a measured, practiced tone that made it clear she had given this exact speech, or some close variation of it, many times before. Clutch rejection, she explained, was not simple abandonment, but a critical evolutionary mechanism, refined over thousands of years, that ensured the strength and viability of future Draconi generations. Hatchlings displaying certain traits, whether physical weakness, unusual coloration, or developmental irregularities, were identified early and allowed to return to the natural order rather than burden Clutch resources that could be better directed toward viable offspring. I listened to this explanation with a growing knot of anger in my chest, though I forced myself to remain outwardly calm. When Caldorath finished, she turned to address me directly, her tone shifting from formal recitation to something more pointed. "Human," she said, "you have interfered with a tradition that predates your species' presence in this quadrant by many centuries. I understand this may seem harsh through the lens of your own cultural values, but I would ask you to consider that every species develops survival mechanisms suited to its own nature. What appears cruel to human sensibilities may simply be practical wisdom refined through the patience of deep time." I felt every eye in the room settle on me, and for a moment, the weight of that attention nearly stole the careful argument I had spent 7 sleepless nights constructing. But then I felt Ash shift against my chest, a small, warm, living presence that reminded me exactly why I was standing here, and the words came more easily than I expected. "Ambassador Caldorath," I began, "I do not dispute that Draconi tradition has served your species well for a very long time. I am not here to argue that your entire system of clutch selection is wrong, but I would ask this council to consider something simpler than tradition versus culture. I would ask you to consider what actually happened aboard that ship." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to hold their attention, before continuing. "A hatchling was found alive, healthy according to every medical assessment our station has been able to perform, displaying no genuine physical weakness beyond an unusual coloration that your own crew could not explain with any medical certainty. He was not euthanized through any deliberate process rooted in careful evolutionary judgment. He was simply left, alone, in the wreckage of a damaged ship, because nobody wanted to be the one to decide his fate either way." Elder Vashtir, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke, his voice deep and measured, carrying an authority that made the entire room go still. "And what would you have had the crew do, human?" Vashtir asked. "Would you have them abandon centuries of established practice on the basis of one crash, one moment of chaos, one hatchling whose survival you personally chose to prioritize?" "I would have them look at him," I said, gesturing gently to Ash, who peered up from his sling with wide, curious eyes, seemingly unaware that he was the subject of such intense scrutiny, not at a color chart, not at a tradition, at him, a living creature who has done nothing except exist in a form that made someone uncomfortable. A murmur passed through the Draconi section of the room, and I could not immediately tell whether it carried disapproval or something closer to consideration. Caldorath's tail flicked sharply, a gesture I had come to recognize as genuine irritation. "Sentiment is not law, human," she said. "Your emotional attachment to this creature does not change the legal and cultural framework governing clutch decisions." "Perhaps not," I said, and then, drawing on the careful legal research I had buried myself in for the better part of a week, I continued. "But treaty law does govern joint recovery operations, and under Section 4 of the current salvage agreement between the Compact and human territories, biological material recovered during joint operations falls under the classification authority of the recovering party, provided that material was not actively claimed or processed by the originating vessel's crew at the time of recovery. Your own crew explicitly refused to claim or process this hatchling. They walked away. I did not steal him from your tradition, Ambassador. I recovered something your own people had already abandoned." The room fell into a heavier silence than before, and I watched Caldorath's expression shift, a flicker of something that might have been genuine surprise passing behind her eyes before the careful diplomatic mask reasserted itself. Elder Vashtir leaned forward slightly, his pale silver eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken, despite my best efforts to remain composed. "You argue treaty technicality," he said slowly, "but I sense there is more beneath your words than legal precision, human. Tell me honestly, if this treaty clause did not exist, would you have taken him regardless?" I did not hesitate. "Yes," I said, "I would have." "Why?" Vashtir asked, and the question carried none of the accusatory edge Caldorath's questions had held, only genuine curiosity. "Because he was alive," I said, "because he was frightened, and because nobody else in that room was willing to be the one to help him. I do not think that requires a treaty clause to justify, Elder. I think it only requires the willingness to look at something small and vulnerable and decide it matters." Vashtir was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting from me to the small grey hatchling nestled against my chest, who chose that exact moment to let out a soft, curious chirp, as though sensing the shift in the room's attention and deciding to investigate it himself. The elder's expression, weathered and unreadable through most of the proceedings, softened almost imperceptibly. "Your species is young," Vashtir said, addressing the room as much as me. "Barely a few centuries into space travel, still learning the shape of the galaxy beyond your own borders. And yet you stand here, prepared to challenge tradition many times older than your entire recorded history, over the fate of a single hatchling, with no political value, no strategic importance, nothing to gain from this defense, beyond the simple fact of his survival." He paused, and I felt the entire room hold its breath alongside me. "I find that either remarkably foolish," Vashtir continued, "or remarkably telling about what your species actually values." Caldorath shifted in her seat, clearly displeased with the direction the conversation had taken. "Elder," she began, but Vashtir raised a clawed hand, silencing her without apparent effort. "I have not yet rendered judgment, Ambassador," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I am considering the full weight of what has been presented here today, and I will not be rushed toward a decision that carries implications beyond this single hatchling." He turned his attention back to me, and something in his expression, ancient and weighing centuries of accumulated wisdom, settled on me with a gravity that made me acutely aware of exactly how much rested on the next few minutes. "Human," Vashtir said, "I will grant this hearing a recess of 3 days, during which I will consult further with the Council regarding the treaty precedent you have raised. In the meantime, the hatchling remains in your custody, provisionally, without further challenge from Compact representatives." Relief washed through me, sharp and immediate, though I was careful not to let it show too openly, aware that the hearing was far from concluded and that provisional custody was not the same as a final ruling. "Thank you, Elder," I said. "Do not thank me yet," Vashtir replied, his tone carrying a weight of warning beneath the words. This council has never before granted formal legal standing to a human argument regarding clutch tradition. Whatever judgment I ultimately render will not simply resolve the fate of one hatchling. It will set precedent for how such matters are handled between our species going forward. That is not a decision I intend to make lightly, and I would advise you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this precedent may not favor the outcome you hope for. I nodded, understanding the weight of his words even as I felt Ash shift against my chest, his small claws catching gently in the fabric of my jacket, entirely unaware of just how much his continued safety now depended on the deliberations of a council he would never fully understand. As the hearing adjourned and the room began to empty, Caldorath approached me briefly, her expression carrying none of the open hostility from earlier, replaced instead by something more complicated, a kind of grudging, uncertain reassessment. "You argue well for someone with no legal training," she said. "I had considerable motivation," I replied, glancing down at Ash, who had already fallen back into a light doze, exhausted by the tension of the proceedings, even though he could not have understood most of what had transpired. Caldorath followed my gaze, and for just a moment, something in her carefully composed expression flickered, softened, before resuming its usual diplomatic neutrality. "He is fortunate," she said quietly, almost to herself, and then turned and left without further comment, leaving me standing alone in the emptying chamber, with 3 days to wait, 3 days that suddenly felt like they might stretch into the longest of my entire life. Whitmore approached a moment later, his expression carrying a cautious optimism that mirrored my own uncertain relief. "That went better than I expected," he said. "Better does not mean finished," I replied, watching the last of the Draconi delegation file out of the chamber, their measured, deliberate movements giving away nothing about which way their deliberations might ultimately fall. "No," Whitmore agreed, "it does not. But you gave them something to think about, Voss. That is more than most people manage against a council that old." I looked down at Ash, still sleeping peacefully against my chest, entirely oblivious to the fact that the next 3 days would likely determine the entire course of his future, and felt a fierce, protective resolve settle over the uncertainty in my chest. 3 days, I thought. I could survive 3 days of waiting. I only hoped that whatever judgment emerged at the end of them would allow us both to survive considerably longer than that. The 3 days of recess passed slower than any stretch of time I could remember. Each hour waited with an anxious uncertainty that made even routine tasks feel impossible to focus on. I returned to my regular duties out of necessity, cataloging incoming supply shipments and filing manifests, but my attention kept drifting, again and again, to the small gray creature who had become, in the span of little more than 2 weeks, the entire center of my world. Ash, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by the political storm swirling around his future. He had grown noticeably in the days since the hearing began, his wings gaining slightly more strength and coordination, his movements less clumsy and uncertain than they had been that first night in the medical bay. He had also developed what Dr. Whitfield described, with clear amusement, as an increasingly assertive personality. He no longer simply tolerated my presence out of necessity. He sought it out, actively, chirping insistently whenever I left him alone for more than a few minutes, following me around my quarters with an unsteady, determined gait whenever the sling was not available to carry him. He had also, much to my chagrin, developed a fondness for chewing on cables, a habit that Callum Ashford discovered the hard way when Ash managed to disable a diagnostic console during an unsupervised moment in the engineering bay. "You cannot keep bringing him to work," Callum said, though his tone carried less irritation than the words suggested, and I caught him, more than once, glancing at Ash with something that looked suspiciously like reluctant fondness whenever he thought nobody was watching. "He does not have anywhere else to be," I replied, watching Ash investigate a discarded bolt with intense, single-minded curiosity, and frankly, given everything happening right now, I would rather keep him close. Callum did not argue further, though he did quietly begin dragon-proofing certain sections of the engineering bay, a small gesture that told me more about his actual feelings on the matter than any words could have. Priya, meanwhile, had become something close to an honorary aunt in Ash's rapidly expanding social circle, stopping by my quarters most evenings with small treats she had somehow procured from the station's limited food stores, teaching him simple games that seemed to delight him despite his obvious lack of understanding regarding their actual rules. "He trusts you completely," Priya observed one evening, watching Ash tumble happily across my quarters in pursuit of a length of ribbon she had brought as a distraction. "It is kind of remarkable, actually, considering how briefly you have known each other." "I do not think trust like that runs on a schedule," I said, watching him with a fondness that had grown considerably stronger than I ever expected, given how suddenly this entire situation had begun. He needed someone to choose him. I think, once someone finally did, everything else followed pretty naturally. Priya smiled, though something more serious passed behind her expression a moment later. "You know the council could still rule against you," she said gently, "even after everything you argued." "I know," I said, and the words carried a weight I had been trying to avoid confronting too directly over the preceding days. "But I am not going to spend these 3 days assuming the worst. Whatever happens, I want him to have had these days without that fear hanging over him too." Not everyone on the station shared this cautious optimism. On the second evening of the recess, I encountered Vrekath in one of the station's quieter corridors, apparently making his way toward the docking bay, and something in his expression, more guarded than usual, made me pause rather than simply nod and continue past him. "Human," he said, acknowledging me with a slight incline of his head. "Vrekath," I replied, keeping my tone carefully neutral, uncertain what kind of interaction to expect, given our tense history since the initial recovery. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze drifting briefly to Ash, who peered out from his sling with wary curiosity, clearly remembering the Draconi liaison from their first encounter in the wrecked breeding chamber. "You surprised me at the hearing," Vrekath finally said. "I did not expect a human logistics officer to construct an argument sophisticated enough to give the elder genuine pause. I did not expect to need one," I replied honestly, "but I was not going to let him be discarded without at least trying." Vrekath's tail moved in a slow, considering arc, a gesture I still could not fully interpret, though it seemed to carry less hostility than our previous encounters. "May I ask you something, human?" he said, and something in his tone suggested this was not simply another attempt at diplomatic pressure. "Go ahead," I said. "Do you understand why clutch rejection exists at all?" he asked. "Not the mechanism, but the reason beneath it." I considered the question carefully before answering. "Why, understand it is meant to strengthen future generations," I said. "Survival of the fittest, applied deliberately rather than left entirely to chance." Vrekath nodded slowly. "That is the surface explanation, yes," he said. "But there is a deeper history beneath it. Centuries ago, before the compact unified Draconi territories, resources were far scarcer than they are now. Clutches were large, food was limited, and difficult choices had to be made about which hatchlings a clutch could realistically support. Rejection was not always about weakness, human. Sometimes it was simply about survival mathematics, choices made under desperate circumstances that eventually calcified into tradition long after the original scarcity had passed. I felt something shift in my understanding, listening to him, a piece of context I had not previously considered. "So the tradition outlived the reason behind it," I said slowly. "Many traditions do," Vrekath replied. "That does not make them easy to challenge, even when the original justification has long since faded. Draconi society values continuity deeply. Changing something this fundamental, even when the underlying logic has weakened, is not a simple matter, regardless of how compelling any individual argument might be." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, genuinely uncertain what had prompted this unexpected openness from someone who had shown me nothing but cold formality since our first encounter. Vrekath was quiet for a moment before answering, his gaze drifting again to Ash, who had grown still and quiet in his sling, watching the Draconi with an intensity that seemed almost too perceptive for a creature so young. "Because I watched that hatchling nearly die in a wreck he had no control over," Vrekath finally said, "and I told myself it was simply nature taking its course. But nature did not orchestrate that crash, human. Chance did. And I have found myself wondering, in the days since, whether convenient tradition and genuine wisdom are truly the same thing, or whether I have simply been telling myself they are for reasons that have very little to do with actual conviction. I did not know how to respond to that, standing in the quiet corridor with a 9-foot Draconi liaison who had, for the first time since I had met him, allowed something genuinely uncertain to show through his careful professional composure. I do not know how the Elder will rule, Vreketh continued after a moment. But whatever the outcome, I wanted you to understand that not every Draconi views this matter as simply as Ambassador Kaldorath presents it. Some of us are watching this hearing with considerably more complicated feelings than the official position might suggest. He inclined his head once more, a gesture that felt, for the first time, genuinely respectful rather than merely formal, and continued on toward the docking bay, without further comment, leaving me standing in the corridor, with Ash pressed quietly against my chest, and a new, unexpected weight settling over the uncertainty I had been carrying since the hearing began. The third day of the recess arrived with an oppressive tension that seemed to have settled over the entire station, crew members moving through their duties with an unusual quietness, as though everyone had somehow absorbed the significance of the coming deliberations without needing to discuss it openly. I spent the morning unable to focus on anything beyond the small creature curled against my side, watching him sleep with a fierce, aching tenderness that had grown steadily since that first desperate moment in the wrecked breeding chamber. He had changed so much in such a short time, from a trembling, rejected hatchling too weak to properly hold his own head up, into a curious, increasingly confident creature who trusted me with an intensity that felt, some mornings, like the single most important responsibility I had ever carried. Whatever the council decided, I thought, watching his small chest rise and fall in peaceful, steady rhythm, I was not going to regret a single moment of the last 2 weeks. Regardless of what came next, I had given him this, safety, at least for a little while, warmth, the simple, uncomplicated experience of being wanted. But as the hour of the reconvened hearing approached, and I made my way once more toward the chamber where Elder Vashtir and the assembled council waited to deliver their judgment, I found myself hoping, with an intensity that surprised even me, that this would not be the only thing I could give him. I wanted more time. I wanted years, decades, however long a creature like him might eventually live. I wanted to watch him grow into whatever he was meant to become, wrong-colored scales and all, without the shadow of rejection following him for the rest of his life. Whatever waited in that chamber, I was prepared to fight for it, with every argument, every ounce of conviction I had left after 3 sleepless, anxious days. I only hoped it would be enough. The hearing chamber felt even more crowded than before, word of the impending decision having spread far enough that additional seating had been brought in to accommodate the swelling crowd of curious station personnel and Draconi observers alike. I made my way to the front with Ash secured in his sling, aware of the weight of every eye following our progress across the chamber floor. Elder Vashtir occupied the same central position as before, flanked by Ambassador Kaldorath and several council members I did not recognize, their expressions carrying the careful, practiced neutrality of officials about to deliver a decision they knew would carry consequences far beyond the room itself. Vreketh sat near the back of the Draconi section, and when our eyes briefly met, he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, though whether it carried encouragement or simply acknowledgement, I could not entirely tell. Commander Whitmore took his seat beside me, his expression carefully composed, though the slight tension in his shoulders betrayed an anxiety that matched my own. Vashtir waited until the chamber had fully settled before speaking, his ancient voice carrying easily across the silent room without any apparent effort. 3 days ago, he began, this council was presented with an argument that challenged not simply the disposition of a single hatchling, but the very foundation of a tradition many centuries older than the treaty under which that argument was constructed. He paused, his pale silver eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd before settling on me. In the time since, I have consulted extensively with council historians, treaty scholars, and elders whose memory of clutch tradition extends further into our recorded history than my own considerable years allow. What I have learned has complicated this matter far beyond a simple question of legal precedent. I felt my pulse quicken, uncertain whether this complication favored the outcome I hoped for or threatened it further. Vashtir continued, his measured tone giving nothing away. Our historians confirm what one of our own liaisons has apparently already shared with the human petitioner, he said, and I caught a flicker of surprise passing across several faces in the Draconi section, along with a brief, unreadable glance directed toward Vrekath, who kept his expression carefully composed. Clutch rejection, in its earliest recorded form, emerged not from a principle of genetic strength, but from practical necessity during a period of significant resource scarcity many centuries ago. Difficult choices were made to ensure clutch survival during times when Draconi civilization had not yet developed the technology or infrastructure to support larger broods. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Kaldorath's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though she said nothing. That scarcity no longer exists, Vashtir continued. Our civilization has long since developed beyond the resource constraints that originally necessitated such difficult choices. And yet the tradition itself persisted, evolving over time into something presented as biological wisdom rather than historical necessity, a transformation that occurred gradually enough that few among even our own people fully recognized it for what it had become. He turned his attention more fully toward me, and something in his expression, weathered by centuries of accumulated experience, carried a weight that made the entire chamber hold its breath alongside me. The human before this council argued that the hatchling in question was rejected not through careful evolutionary judgment, but through the simple momentum of unchallenged tradition, applied without genuine medical justification to a creature whose only true difference was an unusual coloration our own crew could not adequately explain. Having reviewed the medical assessments provided by both human and Draconi physicians in the days since this hearing began, I find this argument, however uncomfortable it may be for this council to accept, to be substantially correct. Relief flooded through me, sharp and immediate, though I forced myself to remain still, aware that Vashtir had not yet finished speaking. This presents this council with a difficult reckoning, he continued. To rule in favor of returning the hatchling to Draconi custody, under a tradition our own historians now acknowledge has drifted significantly from its original justified purpose, would require this council to prioritize the comfort of unchallenged custom over the well-being of an individual creature who has, by every available medical measure, proven himself entirely viable and healthy. He paused, and the silence in the chamber stretched long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, Ash's small, warm weight pressed against my chest, the only steady, grounding presence in a moment that felt suspended entirely outside of time. It is the judgment of this council, Vashtir finally said, that the hatchling in question shall remain in the custody of the human who recovered him, formally and without further challenge from Draconi authority. Furthermore, this council recommends a broader review of current clutch rejection practices to determine whether the tradition, in its current form, continues to serve any purpose beyond the perpetuation of custom for its own sake. The chamber erupted into a mixture of reactions, murmurs of surprise and discussion rippling through both the human and Draconi sections, and I felt something in my chest loosen so completely that I had to take a slow, deliberate breath just to steady myself against the sudden release of tension I had been carrying for what felt like weeks rather than days. Ash, sensing the shift in the room's energy, chirped softly and pressed himself more firmly against my chest, entirely unaware that the small sound carried the entire weight of everything that had just been decided on his behalf. Ambassador Kaldorath rose from her seat, her expression carefully composed despite what I suspected was considerable internal frustration with the ruling. "Elder," she said, "this decision carries significant implications for compact tradition broadly. Are you certain this is the precedent this council wishes to establish?" Vashtir regarded her for a long moment before answering. "I am certain of nothing regarding the eventual consequences of this decision, Ambassador," he said. "But I am certain that a tradition, which cannot withstand honest scrutiny, is a tradition that deserves that scrutiny, regardless of how uncomfortable the resulting conclusions may prove. This council will not pretend otherwise simply to preserve convenient continuity." Kaldorath said nothing further, though her expression, as she resumed her seat, carried a complicated mixture of frustration and something that might have been reluctant respect. Whitmore leaned toward me as the chamber began to settle, his voice low, but carrying genuine warmth beneath the careful professional composure. "Congratulations, Voss," he murmured. "You just won something considerably larger than a custody dispute." I looked down at Ash, who had settled into a contented doze against my chest, entirely unaware of just how dramatically his future had shifted in the span of that single ruling, and felt a wave of emotion rise in my chest that I was not entirely prepared to manage in a room full of observers. As the hearing formally adjourned and the chamber began to empty, Vreketh approached, his expression carrying something I had not seen from him before, an openness that felt genuinely earned rather than merely diplomatic. "You should know," he said quietly, "that sharing the historical context with you was not something I did lightly. Many among my own people would consider it a betrayal of tradition." "Why did you do it?" I asked. Vreketh glanced down at Ash, still sleeping peacefully against my chest, before answering. "Because I watched him nearly die for a reason that, when I finally examined it honestly, I could not fully justify," he said. "Sometimes recognizing an uncomfortable truth requires someone willing to ask an uncomfortable question. You asked it, human. I simply provided the context necessary for the council to take that question seriously." I extended my hand, an unfamiliar gesture between our species, but one that felt appropriate regardless. "Thank you," I said. Vreketh studied my extended hand for a moment, clearly unfamiliar with the custom, before mimicking the gesture as best his clawed hand allowed, a small, careful clasp that felt considerably more significant than the physical contact itself suggested. "Take care of him," Vreketh said, releasing my hand and glancing once more at the sleeping hatchling. "He is fortunate to have been found by someone who refused to accept convenient answers." He turned and left without further ceremony, and I stood alone in the slowly emptying chamber, Ash warm and safe against my chest, and felt, for the first time since pulling him from the wreckage of that shattered breeding chamber, a genuine and complete sense of relief settle over the anxious uncertainty that had defined nearly every day since. The fight, at least this particular fight, was over. But as I made my way back through the station's corridors, greeted by relieved smiles and quiet congratulations from crew members who had followed the proceedings with genuine investment, I understood, with a clarity that felt entirely separate from the relief of the moment, that this ruling had changed something considerably larger than one hatchling's fate. I had no way of knowing, not yet, just how far the consequences of that single afternoon would eventually reach. Months passed differently after the ruling, settling into a rhythm that felt, for the first time since Ash had entered my life, genuinely peaceful rather than perpetually uncertain. The station's initial fascination with our unusual arrangement gradually softened into ordinary familiarity, the sight of a small grey dragon trailing after me through the corridors becoming simply another fixture of daily life aboard our quiet listening post. Ash grew quickly during those months, his wings gaining strength and coordination with each passing week, his once uncertain, wobbling gait steadying into something more purposeful and confident. Dr. Whitfield tracked his development with careful curiosity, noting each milestone with genuine scientific interest, though she was always quick to remind me that our medical understanding of Draconi development remained limited at best. "He is growing faster than typical Draconi records suggest," she told me one afternoon, reviewing her latest scans with a thoughtful frown. "I do not have enough comparative data to know whether this is simply variation or something related to the same traits that marked him as unusual to begin with." I watched Ash across the medical bay, currently engaged in an enthusiastic investigation of a supply cabinet he had somehow managed to pry partially open, despite Dr. Whitfield's best efforts at dragon-proofing her workspace. "Does it matter?" I asked. "Which explanation is true?" Whitfield considered the question for a moment, before answering. "Probably not for his well-being," she admitted, "but scientific curiosity does not always wait for practical necessity before making itself known." I understood the sentiment, even if my own priorities remained considerably more focused on Ash's daily happiness than on the broader scientific mysteries his existence apparently represented. He had settled into station life with an enthusiasm that surprised even me, forming particular bonds with the handful of crew members who had shown him consistent kindness since those early, uncertain days. Priya remained his favorite outside of my own company, and their relationship had evolved into something that resembled genuine friendship, Ash following her through the engineering bay, with a devotion that occasionally left me feeling mildly jealous, though I never mentioned this to either of them. Even Callum, who had maintained careful professional distance for weeks after the recovery, eventually softened, finding himself, more than once, quietly slipping Ash small treats when he assumed nobody was watching. "The station has adopted him as much as you have," Whitmore observed one evening, watching Ash chase a length of ribbon across the mess hall floor, while a cluster of off-duty crew members looked on with open affection. "That says something about what you accomplished, Voss. Not just for him. For all of us." I considered his words carefully, watching Ash tumble happily across the floor, entirely secure in a world that had once tried, so casually, to discard him before he had even properly opened his eyes. "I think he accomplished it himself," I said finally. "I only gave him the chance to try." But peace, I had learned by then, rarely lasted indefinitely, and the quiet rhythm of those settled months eventually gave way to news that arrived through official compact channels, carried by a formal transmission that Commander Whitmore forwarded to me with a message attached that read simply, "You should see this before anyone else." The transmission detailed the results of the broader review Elder Vashtir had recommended following our hearing, a comprehensive examination of clutch rejection practices conducted across multiple compact territories over the preceding months. The findings, presented in careful, measured diplomatic language, confirmed what Vreketh had shared with me privately so many months earlier. The tradition, as currently practiced, no longer reflected genuine biological necessity, and had instead persisted largely through unchallenged cultural momentum. The Compact Council, the transmission continued, had voted to formally reform clutch rejection protocols across all member territories, replacing automatic rejection based on physical variation with careful individual medical assessment, conducted by trained specialists rather than determined through inherited assumption. I read the transmission twice, hardly able to process the full weight of what it represented. This was not simply about Ash anymore. This was about every future hatchling who might have otherwise faced the same casual dismissal he had nearly suffered. An entire tradition reshaped because one small, frightened creature had refused to simply disappear quietly into wreckage nobody wanted to examine too closely. I found Ash later that evening, curled contentedly in the corner of my quarters that had, over the preceding months, become entirely his own space, and settled down beside him, running a gentle hand along his now considerably larger frame. "You have no idea what you started," I told him quietly, though I knew, even as I said it, that he could not fully understand the words. Whatever wrong-colored scales they saw as a flaw, they are never going to use that excuse again. Not because of anything I argued, because you survived long enough to prove them wrong simply by existing. Ash chirped softly, pressing his head against my hand with the easy, uncomplicated trust that had defined our relationship since almost the very beginning, entirely unaware that his simple survival had become something considerably larger than either of us could have anticipated on that first desperate night in the wrecked breeding chamber. News of the reform spread quickly through both human and Draconi channels, and in the weeks that followed, I found myself receiving occasional messages from Draconi individuals I had never met, some expressing gratitude, others carrying the careful, guarded curiosity of people examining an unfamiliar precedent with genuine interest rather than open hostility. Vreketh visited the station once more during this period, ostensibly for routine diplomatic business, though he made a point of seeking me out during a quiet moment between official duties. "The reform has not been universally welcomed," he told me, watching Ash investigate a newly delivered supply crate with characteristic enthusiasm. "Some among the older generations view it as an unwelcome disruption of tradition, but among younger Draconi, particularly those who have grown up questioning practices they never fully understood the justification for, the response has been considerably more positive." "Change rarely happens without resistance," I said, watching Ash abandon the crate in favor of attempting, with limited success, to climb onto a nearby storage container. "No," Vreketh agreed, but it happens regardless, given enough time and enough willingness to ask difficult questions. He paused, watching Ash with an expression that had softened considerably since our first tense encounter aboard the wrecked breeding vessel. "He has grown a great deal," he observed. "He has," I agreed, unable to keep a note of quiet pride from entering my voice. "Dr. Whitfield says his growth pattern continues to differ from standard Draconi development records. She thinks it might be connected to whatever trait originally marked him as unusual." Vrekath considered this information for a long moment before responding. "Perhaps his difference was never truly a flaw at all," he said slowly. "Perhaps it was simply something our own understanding had not yet developed the wisdom to properly recognize." I thought about those words often in the weeks that followed, watching Ash continue to grow and change in ways that increasingly diverged from anything Dr. Whitfield's limited comparative data could adequately explain. His scales, once uniformly ash-gray, had begun developing subtle variations, faint patterns emerging beneath the surface that seemed to shift almost imperceptibly depending on his mood or the quality of surrounding light. His wings, once too weak to support even the shortest flight, had strengthened considerably, and Dr. Whitfield's most recent assessments suggested he might eventually develop flight capabilities considerably earlier than typical Draconi development timelines predicted. Whatever he was becoming, it was clear, even to my untrained eye, that he was not simply an ordinary hatchling who happened to survive against difficult odds. Something about him was genuinely unusual, in ways that extended well beyond the coloration that had originally marked him for rejection. Did not fully understand what that meant, not yet, standing in my quarters one quiet evening months after the reform had reshaped Draconi tradition, watching Ash sleep peacefully in the corner that had become entirely his own space aboard our small station. I only knew that whatever he ultimately became, he had already proven, simply through his continued survival, that the traits which once marked him as unworthy of even basic consideration had never actually been the flaws everyone assumed them to be. The galaxy, it seemed, was slowly beginning to understand this too, but understanding, I was about to learn, did not always arrive without complications of its own, and the true scope of exactly what Ash represented had only just begun to reveal itself. The discovery came, as most significant discoveries seemed to in this particular chapter of my life, without warning, arriving during what should have been a routine follow-up examination in the station's medical bay. Dr. Whitfield had requested a full genetic comparison scan, a procedure she had been unable to properly conduct during Ash's initial examination due to limited Draconi genetic reference data available to our station at the time. In the month since, however, the broader compact reforms had opened previously restricted genetic archives to joint human Draconi research initiatives, and Whitfield had spent weeks petitioning for access to conduct a more thorough comparative analysis. I sat beside the examination table, watching Ash endure the scanning process with considerably more patience than he had shown during his very first medical assessment, his now much larger frame stretched comfortably across the table's padded surface, while Whitfield's equipment hummed quietly through its analysis. "This is going to take a while to process properly," Whitfield said, monitoring the incoming data with focused concentration, "but I am seeing some preliminary markers already that are quite interesting." "Interesting how?" I asked, feeling a familiar knot of anxious curiosity settle in my chest, the same uncertain tension that had accompanied nearly every significant development in Ash's life since that first desperate night in the wrecked breeding chamber. Whitfield did not answer immediately, her attention fixed on her scanner readouts with growing intensity, and I waited, watching Ash shift restlessly on the examination table, clearly growing bored with the extended procedure. Finally, Whitfield looked up, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of scientific excitement and genuine uncertainty. "His genetic markers do not match standard Draconi bloodlines currently catalogued in the archive," she said slowly. "Not entirely, at least. There are similarities, certainly, but also significant divergences that suggest something considerably older than the modern Draconi genetic lineage." I felt my pulse quicken. "Older how?" I asked. "The archive includes historical genetic samples preserved from wild, unbonded Draconi populations," Whitfield explained, populations that existed before the compact's ancestors developed the structured clutch breeding practices that eventually became standard across Draconi society. Those wild bloodlines largely disappeared centuries ago, absorbed or displaced as structured breeding became the dominant practice. But some of the genetic markers I am seeing in Ash's sample align remarkably closely with those historical wild population samples. I stared at Ash, who had abandoned any pretense of patience and was now attempting, with characteristic determination, to investigate a nearby equipment cart, despite Whitfield's repeated attempts to redirect his attention. "Are you saying he is descended from those wild populations?" I asked. "It is possible," Whitfield said carefully, "though I want to be clear that this preliminary analysis requires considerably more research before I would state that with genuine confidence. But if accurate, it would explain a great deal about the traits that originally marked him as unusual within his clutch. His coloration, his growth pattern, even the developmental differences we have observed throughout his life could all trace back to genetic lineage that modern Draconi breeding practices simply have not encountered in many generations." I sat with that information for a long moment, watching Ash finally succeed in tipping over the equipment cart he had been investigating, sending several instruments clattering across the medical bay floor with a crash that made Whitfield wince, but did not diminish Ash's evident satisfaction with his accomplishment. "He is not defective at all," I said slowly, the realization settling over me with a weight that felt both vindicating and strangely emotional. "He is rare, a living connection to something the modern compact assumed had disappeared entirely." Whitfield nodded, already moving to gather the scattered instruments Ash had liberated from the cart. "That would be my preliminary assessment, yes," she said, "though I imagine this discovery is going to generate considerably more interest from Draconi research institutions than either of us might be entirely comfortable with." Her prediction proved accurate faster than either of us anticipated. Word of the genetic discovery reached compact authorities within days of Whitfield's initial findings being formally documented, and the response, when it arrived, carried a very different tone than the tense, adversarial energy of our earlier custody dispute. This time, the transmission came directly from Elder Vashtir, requesting a formal meeting to discuss what he described, in careful diplomatic language, as findings of significant historical and scientific importance to Draconi cultural heritage. I met with him days later, this time in a considerably smaller, more private setting than the crowded hearing chamber where our earlier confrontation had unfolded. Ash accompanied me, as he always did, though he had grown large enough by this point that he could no longer comfortably fit in the sling that had once carried him everywhere, instead walking beside me with a confident, steady gait that bore little resemblance to the trembling, uncertain creature I had first pulled from the wreckage so many months earlier. Vashtir studied Ash with open fascination as we entered, his ancient eyes carrying none of the careful diplomatic distance from our previous encounter. "He has grown remarkably," he observed. "He has," I agreed, settling into the seat across from him, while Ash investigated the unfamiliar room with characteristic curiosity. "I have reviewed Dr. Whitfield's genetic findings extensively," Vashtir said, his tone carrying a weight of genuine reverence that surprised me. "If her preliminary assessment proves accurate through further research, this hatchling represents something our people have not encountered in many centuries. A living link to bloodlines we believed entirely lost to history." I watched Ash settle contentedly at my feet, entirely unaware that he had just become the subject of considerable historical fascination among a civilization that had once nearly discarded him without a second thought. "What does that mean for him?" I asked carefully. "Practically speaking." Vashtir considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "It means," he said, "that many among my people will likely wish to study him, to understand what his genetic heritage might reveal about our own history and development as a species. It also means, and I say this with full awareness of the irony involved, that many will likely wish to claim him given his apparent historical and cultural significance." I felt a familiar protective tension rise in my chest, the same fierce instinct that had driven me to challenge an entire tradition so many months earlier. "He is not a historical artifact," I said, keeping my voice level despite the emotion beneath it. "He is not a research specimen either. He is a living creature who already survived one attempt by your people to treat him as expendable, based on characteristics they did not understand. Vashtir's expression softened, something that might have been approval passing behind his ancient eyes. I anticipated that response, he said, and I want to assure you, human, that this council has no intention of repeating the mistakes of the past regarding this hatchling's disposition. The ruling establishing your custody remains fully in effect, regardless of whatever additional significance his genetic heritage may carry. Relief loosened the tension in my chest, though a lingering wariness remained. Then why request this meeting, I asked. Because I believe there is value in cooperation rather than conflict, Vashtir said. Draconi researchers would benefit greatly from studying what Ash represents, with appropriate consent and appropriate limitations, conducted collaboratively rather than through any attempt at reclamation. And I suspect, given the bond you clearly share with him, that you might find value in better understanding exactly what he is and what he might eventually become. I looked down at Ash, who had abandoned his exploration of the room in favor of resting his head against my leg, apparently satisfied that whatever conversation was occurring above him did not require his immediate attention. I will consider it, I said finally. But any research happens with his well-being prioritized above scientific curiosity, and it happens with my full oversight, every step of the way. He is not a specimen to be studied at anyone's convenience. He is family. Vashtir nodded slowly, something in his expression carrying genuine respect. I would expect nothing less, he said. And I suspect, human, that this arrangement, cooperation between our peoples regarding something as significant as this discovery, may prove considerably more valuable than either of us currently anticipates. I did not fully understand, in that quiet meeting, exactly how prophetic his words would eventually prove to be. I only knew, watching Ash rest peacefully against my leg, entirely secure in a world that had once tried so casually to discard him, that whatever came next, whatever historical significance or scientific fascination his existence might generate, the fundamental truth of our bond remained unchanged. He had been rejected once, for reasons that ultimately proved to be nothing more than misunderstanding and unchallenged assumption. He was never going to be rejected again, not while I had any say in the matter, regardless of how significant or ordinary the galaxy eventually decided his existence actually was. That certainty, more than any genetic discovery or historical revelation, remained the one truth I was never going to allow anyone to challenge. Years moved differently once Ash reached his full adult size. The small ash-gray hatchling, who had once fit easily within a makeshift sling, growing into a creature whose presence commanded genuine respect throughout the station, his wings finally strong enough to carry him in slow, graceful circuits above the station's exterior docking platforms whenever the pressurized atmosphere shields allowed for such exercise. His scales had settled, over those years, into a deep, striking silver gray, marked with faint patterns that shifted subtly depending on his mood, a trait Dr. Whitfield eventually confirmed as a genuine remnant of the ancient wild bloodline his genetic markers had first revealed years earlier. He was, by every measure available to Draconi researchers who had studied him extensively during that time, exactly what Elder Vashtir had once suggested he might be, a living connection to a heritage the Compact had long assumed entirely lost to history. The research collaboration Vashtir had proposed during that early meeting had continued steadily throughout the intervening years, conducted always under careful oversight, always with Ash's comfort and consent, insofar as such consent could be reasonably interpreted, prioritized above any purely academic curiosity. What began as cautious, uncertain cooperation between two species with a genuinely difficult history had gradually evolved into something considerably more collaborative, more trusting, than either side had likely anticipated during those early, tense negotiations. I remained by his side throughout all of it, no longer simply his caretaker in the way I had been during those first fragile weeks, but something closer to genuine family, a bond that had grown and deepened through years of shared experience, in ways that felt entirely natural, despite the vast differences between our two species. The station itself had changed as well during those years, our small listening post gradually becoming something of an unofficial symbol within broader compact human relations, a place where the story of a rejected hatchling and the human who refused to accept his abandonment had become, in its own quiet way, a foundational example of what genuine cooperation between our species could accomplish when either side was willing to challenge convenient assumption in favor of honest examination. Vreketh visited often during those years, his career having shifted considerably following the broader reforms his willingness to share difficult historical context had helped inspire. He now served in a role focused specifically on cross-species research collaboration, a position that had not existed prior to the reforms Ash's story had ultimately helped set in motion. "You have built something remarkable here," he told me during one such visit, watching Ash glide in slow, confident circles above the docking platform, his silver-gray scales catching the light in patterns that still, after all these years, held a kind of quiet, understated beauty that never failed to leave me watching with genuine wonder. "I did not build anything," I replied, watching Ash execute a graceful landing that would have been impossible for the trembling, uncertain hatchling I had first pulled from that wrecked breeding chamber so many years earlier. I just refused to look away from something that mattered. Vriketh considered this for a moment, before responding, his expression carrying the same thoughtful weight it had held during our very first genuinely honest conversation, years earlier, in that quiet station corridor. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but sometimes refusing to look away is precisely what building something remarkable requires." I thought about those words often in the years that followed, watching Ash continue to grow and thrive in ways that had once seemed impossible for a creature so casually discarded by the very people who should have protected him. He had become, without ever intending to, something considerably larger than simply my companion. He had become a living argument against every assumption that convenience and tradition should ever outweigh genuine examination of what actually mattered. The broader galaxy had taken notice as well, in its own gradual, careful way. Stories of Ash's survival and eventual thriving had spread far beyond our small station, carried through official compact channels and informal conversation alike, reaching Draconi communities across multiple territories who had, in the years since the reforms, begun slowly reconsidering assumptions about difference and worth that had gone largely unchallenged for centuries. I did not know, in those early desperate days pulling a trembling hatchling from broken shell fragments, that I was setting any of this in motion. I only knew, in that single, immediate moment, that something small and frightened needed help, and that I was not willing to walk away simply because helping seemed inconvenient or complicated by circumstances beyond my understanding. That simple, uncomplicated decision had rippled outward in ways I could never have anticipated, reshaping not just one creature's future, but an entire tradition's relationship with the assumptions that had once defined it. On quiet evenings, when the station settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, and Ash curled contentedly in the space that remained entirely his own within my quarters despite his now considerable size, I found myself thinking often about that first night, about the desperate cry that had cut through smoke and wreckage, about the small trembling body pressed against my chest as I made a decision that had, in hindsight, changed considerably more than I ever expected. He was not, and had never truly been, defective. He was not, and had never truly been, unworthy of care and protection. He had simply been born into circumstances that valued convenient assumption over genuine understanding, and it had taken one stubborn refusal to accept that assumption to reveal exactly how wrong it had been. I do not know what the coming years will bring, for either of us, or for the broader relationship between our two species that his story had helped, in its own small way, to reshape. I only know that whatever comes next, I will face it the same way I faced that very first moment in the wrecked breeding chamber, with the same simple, unwavering conviction. Some things matter enough to fight for, regardless of how inconvenient or complicated that fight eventually becomes. Ash stirred beside me that evening, his large silver-gray form shifting in his sleep, and I reached out, resting a gentle hand against his scales, feeling the steady, peaceful rhythm of his breathing beneath my palm. No dragon had wanted him, once. No clutch had claimed him, No tradition had made room for whatever difference marked him as unworthy of even basic consideration. And in the years since that single, desperate decision, that simple choice to refuse convenient abandonment in favor of genuine care, had grown into something neither of us could have imagined that first trembling night. A home, a family, a bond that no tradition, no assumption, no casual dismissal had ever managed to break. And as Ash's breathing settled into the deep, peaceful rhythm of genuine rest beside me, I understood, with a certainty that had only grown stronger through every year that followed, that I would make exactly the same choice again, without hesitation, regardless of whatever cost or complication it might eventually demand. Some things, once found, are simply worth keeping. He was worth keeping. He always had been.